Michael David Fox. I'm the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, East European Studies here at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And events have been proceeding with such great rapidity that we are very pleased to have two of our leading specialists on Russia and Russian-American relations here. And I'm very glad to see so many students, alumni, and faculty in the audience. I'm going to very briefly introduce the speakers, who to many of you need no introduction, and then turn it over to them. Jill Doherty is adjunct professor at Ceres and also a former CNN bureau chief in Moscow, as well as having held many positions at CNN, including White House correspondent. She will be in discussion with Angela Stent, Director Emerita of Ceres, and also our current senior advisor and president of our board of advisors, and one of the world's leading experts on Russian-American relations. So, welcome.
Thank you. So first of all, I have to apologize. I'm losing my voice, so hopefully they'll turn the microphone off. Can you hear me? You can, great. On, I mean. So as I was coming here, I saw a picture of the latest edition of Private Eye, which is a British satirical magazine. And it has Trump and Zelensky standing together. And Trump looms over Zelensky and he said, "Do you know what the peace plan is?" And Zelensky says, "I give in." And Trump says, "Correct." So we now have this extraordinary situation, which I don't think anybody would have thought would happen so quickly. I wrote a book a number of years ago, actually 10 years ago, called The Limits of Partnership, U.S.-Russian Relations in the 21st Century. And I showed in that book why every U.S. president since the collapse of the Soviet Union has tried to improve relations with Russia, has tried to find the golden key, has thought that they could do it better than their predecessors. And all of these resets failed because, as I wrote in the book, the U.S. has a very different idea of the drivers of world politics, a world outlook, than the Russian leader does. And I have to say, when I look at what's happened in the last month, I think we now have a president who has a similar view of the drivers of world politics to President Putin, and therefore his reset in his own mind might succeed. I mean, it's early days yet. But what you saw at this meeting in Riyadh was essentially a restoration of the relationship between the US and Russia, not as it was in February, 22, but years ago, an agreement to, restaff the embassies, which is important because, in fact, the US embassy in Moscow has had a very hard time operating with so few people. And the Russian embassy also, I think it has more people than we do in Moscow, but still, that's okay. But then talking about increased economic cooperation, all these great investment opportunities in Russia. We have Professor Vadim Grishin here, who's written extensively about all of that, and I'm sure can say something about that. I would take that with a huge grain of salt. And then improving political ties. We're going to restore all these things. And that's what Putin wanted. He wanted from this meeting a restoration of US-Russian relations and improvement. He is not interested in a peace agreement because he still believes that he's winning this war. And he looks at Europe. Now you see Europe dithering about what to do because they finally realized, particularly after the Munich Security Conference, that the US is leaving Europe. I mean, Trump is going to leave Europe, and that they're on their own. They have to spend much more on defense. And if they want to support Ukraine, they have to have a different plan than they've had before. When Putin looks at this, for centuries, or at least, decades at least, since the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet and Russian leaders have tried to split the US and Europe. They've never liked the transatlantic alliance, and particularly since the end of World War II. And now finally it's happening, and they didn't even do it. I mean, it's done by a US president. So And so that's what Putin's seeing. And I think he believes if he waits long enough, you will have this split in the alliance. US assistance for Ukraine will dry up, and Russia will prevail. And the terms that the US has now proposed to Ukraine, recognize that you've lost all this territory. You cannot join NATO for a long time, if ever. And there will be no US troops if there is a peacekeeping force on the border after the war ends. And that's a big if. And, we don't know whether that's going to happen. So these are essentially Putin's conditions, but I don't think he's going to be very interested in actually negotiating a peace deal. And that's what we'll have to look for in the next few months. So I think we're in a very different place than we were a couple of months ago, and in a very dark hour for Ukraine. And all of the things that President Trump has said, he's a dictator, he has 4% popularity, he started the war, and even other officials, as you were just saying, in the Trump administration, who won't refute that. These really are alternative facts. And, I'm still on X, a lot of people aren't. And I just saw something which Elon Musk reposted, which is a picture of Zelensky with a Hitler mustache. So, this is what they're doing. And of course, Elon Musk has a lot more power in this. We know that he's had a relationship with Putin over the years because of his own interest, clearly, with SpaceX. And I think the final thing I'll say, and I'll turn it over to you, is this rare earth minerals deal. My understanding is that the Treasury Secretary arrived in Kyiv. The embassy got a copy of this an hour before he arrived. And so Zelensky really didn't have any time to peruse it. And, it would have involved the US taking over 50% of the minerals and the rare earth, and owning them. And of course, Zelensky didn't sign that. I mean, it's a kind of a colonial agreement, the kind of thing that the Soviet Union used to do. So, but I think that's one of the reasons for Trump's ire, is that Zelensky didn't sign this, and this is supposed to be payback for the support that the US gave. So I'm interested in your take on this.
Wow. Well, I was thinking, maybe we'll have a debate. Well, there's not going to be much of a debate because basically everything you said, I agree with, sadly, I think, for me, because Angela has such a deep knowledge of the region, and especially that US-Russia relationship. And mine is, since I still work in the media, it's more superficial. I'm only kidding. But I do tend to look at optics a lot of times. And I think in this administration, optics are extremely important. In fact, I would say they are paramount in this administration. So if you stand back, really look at this, I think we are both stunned by the speed. Michael used the word rapidity. It's stunning speed of all sorts of different ideas flying out there, many of them undefined. There are very few details, but a lot of kind of generalities of what we could do. And if you look at before Riyadh, where Russia and the United States officials met, I think my idea was, well, they're going to discuss Ukraine, and they kind of did. But I think what we've got is two levels of conversation, two tracks going on. One would be Ukraine, again, with very few details, and the other is US-Russia. Yeah. And I totally agree that the focus is on US-Russia. I don't think that President Trump either has a plan or is particularly interested, and I mean this objectively, I don't mean this as a, as criticism, gratuitous criticism. I mean, I don't think there is a plan. There's a general idea, and I think the idea by President Trump is to get this thing off the table as quickly as possible. Let's get Ukraine. This is an impediment to a whole lot of things. And we cannot forget that Ukraine was a critical element, Zelensky, in the impeachment of President Trump. So there is, in
Mhm.
addition to, history and military and economics and all of that, there is a very strong personal element
yeah.
to this. And I think the animus that was expressed over the past couple of days is proof of that. I mean, dictator, and then Zelensky, sadly, because he is insulted at that point, he says President Trump lives in a disinformation space, as he put it. And then, of course, I think it was Vice President Vance said, hey, how dare he insult our president? So we have this ad hominem, fighting, which is really, really bad. And every time I'm doing a live shot for CNN, I say,
Yeah.
this is exactly what Putin wants. Putin is thrilled with this. And as usual, Putin does not have to do much of anything except sit there and watch this. So I think, but getting back to kind of that idea, I think Ukraine is being talked about, but even today, we didn't get a news conference after the meeting with General Kellogg and Zelensky in Kyiv. No news conference. I think there was a readout by Zelensky, but who said it was, useful or something. But we don't really know what they talked about. We will eventually, obviously, find out. But the other track is this relationship with Russia. And that, I think, is probably, I'm not going to say the most important, because they're both hugely important. But I think as Trump tries to create this relation or recreate this relationship, and I'll just mark this down as a great question for you. Dr. Stent has talked about, resets and failed resets and all that. I'm going to get your opinion on this new reset. I'm going to call it a reset, because it is an attempt at a reset. But this is a reset with different parameters. I mean, this is, what anyone was trying to do. Secretary Clinton taking the button, to Lavrov. That's nothing compared to what we're talking about here. So getting back to Ukraine, I think Zelensky, no question, is in a very difficult situation right now. I wonder how he even feels that they can negotiate at this point, because the negotiations almost feel over. This is what I don't understand. If in bargaining, Putin's way of bargaining, and you know this better than I do, is that you slam the other guy up against the wall, you demand the world, and then let them backtrack, and then you get something, et cetera. Trump seems to be trying to do some of that, but he's doing it to Zelensky, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense. But and this is my personal opinion, I do believe that the way President Trump looks at the situation is that, and maybe this is an exaggeration, but we could have a great debate about it, that Putin gets Russia, Central Europe, let's say, we'll leave out the Baltics for a second, but they could be coming. He gets Ukraine, Moldova, he already has Belarus, he gets Romania, et cetera. And then we have to move the border out a little bit toward Poland, so you begin to wonder what happens. And then you can always have the Baltics. And President Trump gets Greenland, Canada, the United States, I'm not kidding, Greenland, Canada, the United States, and Panama Canal. Mexico, I wonder about that. But in any case, he gets the Western Hemisphere, and Putin gets the eastern part of Europe. And I think, honest to goodness, that is how he looks at it. Now, we tried that in the 1800s, so we'll see how all of this works out. But in the meantime, Ukraine is in very serious situation right now. And I don't see I'll just end with this and then we can go back and forth, but I see no demand by the United States on Putin. I see no demand whatsoever. Putin, what he is saying right now and what Lavrov and the minions are saying is exactly what Putin said in the summer before the full-scale invasion. with these, again, no NATO, all the territory will take, Crimea, Donbass, NATO out of Europe,
Right.
NATO out of
Yeah.
Europe, United States out of Europe, any missiles out of Europe, the whole 9 yards. So with that, maybe we can continue.
We can. So certainly Putin has said, for a long time, at least for the last 10 years, that Yalta was a great system. It kept the peace. And, we should go back to that, implying that the Chinese would also have a sphere of influence. And we know that that's his ultimate aim. If you look at the treaties that were presented to NATO and the US in December of 2021, which the US tried to negotiate in good faith, but clearly they were never serious about it. The Russians, they want NATO to pull back to where it was in 1997, before the first enlargement. And they believe that they have a right to a sphere of influence, not only in the post-Soviet space, but in the former Warsaw Pact countries. And Putin has been trying to undo the post-Cold War settlement really since he came to power. And he's felt emboldened to do that. So Ukraine is one piece of it. So that's definitely what he wants. And, I come back to different worldviews. I think that's Trump's worldview too. The Russians get to keep that. Chinese, I'm not so sure about, but we can see. And the US gets what it has. I think the irony is if Canada were made a 51st state, that most Canadians would vote Democratic, right? So I don't think that would help the Republicans. And then he gets Greenland with more rare earth materials. So I think he sees the world very much in the same way. We divide it up. And, this is Putin's his conception of sovereignty, right? Putin thinks there are only 3 or 4 truly sovereign countries, Russia, the US, China, and probably India. And all other countries have limited sovereignty. And they have to do what the US says. And I think Trump has exactly the same view. And so I think that is what Putin is in the long run aiming for. I agree with you. I don't think there is a peace plan I think what Trump wants is a ceasefire. If he can say, okay, the shooting stopped, I get my Nobel Peace Prize. But he hasn't thought about any other details. By the way, the Kellogg, they were supposed to have a press conference today, and the US side canceled it.
Yes.
And I think, General Kellogg, and by the way, I'm proud to say that one of our series graduates is in Kellogg's team, Jonathan Hayes. And I saw him on CNN this morning getting out of the train in Kyiv. And he's very good. So I'm glad he's on it. But Kellogg is much more critical of Russia. And he's been seeing what the devastation in Kyiv is. And maybe they didn't have a press conference because, who knows? But he might have not said the same things as Waltz and Rubio said, and Witkoff as well. But I also have to say, it's very strange to have the man who was initially appointed as the chief Russia-Ukraine special envoy only talking to the Ukrainians and not talking to the Russians. I mean, yes, of course they can coordinate, but so but I think you're right. I think that the Trump team don't really have a peace plan, but they're interested apparently in the same thing that Putin is, which is, as you say, the restoration of the relationship and, to new heights, and who knows what else is going to happen.
Think about Europe. I mean, Europe, at this point, they're very worried, obviously, but they had their meeting in Paris, I think, on Monday.
They had another meeting.
And another meeting. So what do they do?
Well, some of them realize they have to really beef up their own defenses and they have to do more. Britain has said that it will send troops. Prime Minister Starmer said that, and he's coming, I think, tonight or tomorrow to the US. The French have said that they'll do more. The Germans, we have an election coming up on Sunday, and the Germans are really divided about this. The Poles and the Balts obviously will do more, but what can they actually do? Because Lavrov has said no European troops can be peacekeepers, and no European country that's a member of NATO, even if it's not NATO troops. Again, maybe things are out for negotiation, but so far you have a situation where you know, I haven't read The Art of the Deal, but I have an idea about what's in it. You know, the art of the deal, you don't concede everything to the person you're negotiating with before you start the negotiation. So I think the Europeans, I mean, the Munich Security Conference was the seminal moment, right? When you have a US vice president stand up and say the Europeans are undemocratic and they don't have free speech because they hadn't invited the AfD, the extreme right-wing neo-Nazi party, to the Munich Security Conference, and they suppressed free. And then he met with the leader of the extreme right party, and he wouldn't meet with Chancellor Scholz. So I think they're, you know, at sixes and sevens. But I think you will have a kind of a coalition of the willing Europeans. The EU has just allocated some more money to Ukraine, but they don't have the military hardware to supply Ukraine that we have. But they will try and do more, but they're also not completely united on this. So,
you know,
yeah.
we could, well, I was just thinking we could talk for maybe 10 more minutes. I know there'll be a lot of questions, but could I ask, and you know, we'll discuss this obviously, but this idea of a ceasefire and calling it the end of the war, just framing it that way, versus a long, durable peace. Now, I think that Trump could definitely take a ceasefire, you know, and there would be pictures, there would be video of the guns fall silent. This would be a visual moment in history. The guns fall silent. You know, men are in their trenches, relaxing and smoking cigarettes, and the war is over. Okay. Now, let's think about Putin. So, is a ceasefire enough? Well, it's never enough for him. But what would he do with, let's just have a ceasefire? And then, of course, the implications of a ceasefire versus a long, durable peace, which the Europeans want. So let's start with Putin. What do you think?
Well, I mean, if there was a ceasefire, okay, he might accept that, but for how long? I mean, the only ceasefire that will work permanently is if, you know, Ukraine has security assurances, guarantees to deter Russia, because otherwise, you know, the Russian army will recoup and it'll reinvade. I mean, he still wants to get rid of Zelensky and to have a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. And he's not going to get that at the moment. So I think my prediction is he will not agree to a ceasefire very quickly. And maybe at some point, President Trump will get frustrated because he wants that to happen quickly. And then he wants to show, you know, that he did it. I think that's going to be very complicated because if you have a ceasefire, then you really have to have someone enforcing it. And it's not clear, you know, all right, you can get UN peacekeepers, maybe Chinese, Indian, other nationalities there, but and so I think, as I say, I don't think Putin's interested in ending the war. And I
You
think
mean in long term?
in long term, I mean, at the moment, you know, again, they say now that the Russian economy this year will be able to, you know, continue to support this war. But next year it could get much more difficult. So I think that, you know, that could be another calculation.
Which raises a question. If you, I mean, Putin has to sell this to his people too. You know, he has to sell to the Russian people. He set this out, or at least I think he does. He set out these goals and they have never varied. You know, he, again, for 3 years, he's been saying the same thing. So can he sell this to the, of course he can sell almost anything.
Well, I was going to say, he can sell anything, but he can declare victory and then the people will believe him. I mean, the bloggers, the military bloggers who think he's not tough enough, they'll criticize him, but he can sell that.
All right.
And, you know, I think a significant, I mean, according to the Levada polls, a significant number of Russians favor negotiations. Now, they don't favor giving up territory, but it doesn't look as if Russia's going to have to give up any territory now, you know, the way that the Trump administration is dealing with them.
And then Trump could sell it, question mark, to the American people? I think yes, because, you know, I mean, Americans, for the most part, really don't know a lot about the war. They don't know a lot of the details. And to have the guns fall silent, I think, you know, he could say, fighting over, you know, that we want.
Not giving them any money.
And so that raises this really long-term serious question for Europe. Because if it is just a ceasefire, and then Putin continues to move on the battlefield and then possibly farther west, it's extraordinarily dangerous. And it's dangerous for the United States, because if Europe then is inflamed with a bigger war, if Putin does move farther west, what does the United States do? That's why rationally, I would like to think that the administration would think about a long-term solution and what it means and how you protect, how you do it. But at this point, it looks like you just stop the fighting, and then what?
Well,
And
Trump
then-
has said we have a beautiful ocean between us and Europe.
Well,
He doesn't know any
That's
history.
like 1800.
Right, and he doesn't realize that twice in the 20th century, the United States had to intervene in wars in Europe that threatened its own security. But and today, I think he said something like Poland had invaded Germany, and that was the beginning of World War II.
Oh, no.
So, I mean, if you say things like that, I want to say one other thing. I think one of the ways that Putin has prepared for this war is all of the disinformation and really supporting the kind of pro-Russian far right in Europe and in the United States. And you see that now. They've been very assiduously cultivating that. And so the AfD, Marine Le Pen's party, Reform in Britain, and a lot of the MAGA people support Russia because they have
The vice president.
and the vice president, they have bought all of this. And also Putin has been very successful in selling, and this comes back to our own country and the culture wars. Russia is this anti-woke country. I was thinking back to the Valdai in 2013. I don't know whether you were there.
Yes.
But that's when he talked about how,
I remember
Western
that so well.
Christianity was satanic, and we'd lost our way, and we have 33 genders and all those kind of things. And he has used that to appeal to populations in Europe and the US, which explains partly why. I mean, sometimes I see these clips of MAGA voters, and they've completely bought the fact that Putin's a great leader and that Zelensky is a drug addicted, whatever Nazi. And that's another aspect of that, which, it's quite extraordinary if you think in the first few days of the war, it looked as if Russia was doing really badly. It didn't capture Kyiv, the Ukrainians fought back. And yet 3 years later, the Russian-Chinese relationship is stronger, than it was before. The BRICS are expanding. You have all these countries in the global south who are quite happy to do business with Russia. And now you have a reset with the US. So Putin looks as if he's coming out of this with Russia, a more influential power than it was prior to February 2022.
No question. When you talk about propaganda, this is a minor point, but today I was on X2. I don't know why I stay on, but I still am, because a lot of stuff is happening. And there was Julia Davis, who probably you've heard of her, she has this digest of Russian TV, and she had one of the chief propagandists who said, well, you know why President Trump is saying these things. And it is notable, that within the past few days, the rhetoric has really increased. He said, because of that conversation with Vladimir Putin. And so, in other words, Vladimir Putin convinced Trump of a certain, outlook on the world. And I do think that Putin, we've both seen him in, for hours at Valdai, expounding on things. I think Putin, for a person who doesn't know history and doesn't really know the region, could be very convincing, especially for President Trump, who just, I think, does see the world in many of the same ways. But it's so interesting that they are literally claiming credit for turning or educating Trump in Putin's view because of that conversation, the telephone conversation between Trump and Putin.
So someone who worked in the Trump administration and was present at Trump-Putin meetings said that, Trump is in awe of Putin, and Putin really knows how to manipulate him. He's a KGB case officer. He is a judo champion. And he uses those skills.
He's a tough guy.
He's a tough guy.
Well, should
Yeah.
we open it up for some questions? And we can always go back to our discussion, which of course we could do for hours.
Right.
But questions from the audience? Should we
Important.
see several people here?